All right, so here's the finished exercise where I've created those gradations that I talked to you about. A couple things I want you to keep in mind. One is I actually made this simpler than I intended. I was going to divide this up into 3, and I was going to divide this into 2 or 3 values. But I found that as I was painting with a 7-step scale, given what I was looking at, I didn't have enough values to really do that and keep the integrity of those large shapes that I was talking about. So just err on the side of being simple with this rather than trying to get too complicated. That's going to lead you into making more values than you actually have available to you here on the 7-step scale. Really try to stick to that. So I've created this progression in the light of light to darker to darker. So that's sort of the starting point. We've got these planes of color that are creating this shift. So as that form turns away from the light, as that apple, it's rounded, it's turning away from the light, it's getting darker as it turns away from that light. So that's what I've tried to start to suggest here. And in the shadow, I just have, rather than 3, I just have 2 values. I just found that I didn't have, 3 darks that were gonna work for that register of tone that was in here. Also notice, and this is really important, as you start developing an object, there's gonna be a real tendency to complicate that larger shape or to break it up. And a way that you can sort of test and make sure that you're not doing that is when you create your gradations, then squint at your object, and it should still group into a big light and big shadow shape. So in other words, even though I've got 3 values here, when I squint, this still groups as a light against the shadow, right? So this stays separate from this, even though I've created multiple gradations within each of the light and shadow shapes. So that's really important. You don't want these large light and shadow shapes to become overly complicated or to start changing their shape because you're making them too dark or too light. The other thing I want you to notice is that I've really tried to make definite shapes. I know it looks a little mechanical and it looks really planar. That's okay. The nature of a form out there in the real world is that it has a very particular shape to it. And there's a tendency, I think, when students are beginning to try to get too complex and too soft with the edges and to try to get too subtle too quickly. Just do your best to make, all these shapes are slightly irregular. They're not just, they're not all the same kind of moon shapes. I was looking and trying to find a distinct individual shape for each of those gradations. So, nature is varied. It's not completely symmetrical. So you can't just put in the same stripe, and it's gonna start looking kind of funny, mechanical looking. So, or overly generic kind of roundness. So, so the shapes need to be individual, but they need to be specific. You gotta find real boundaries. Get into the habit of finding boundaries for these shapes. And then as you add more and more shapes and expand your palette, the form will become softer and rounder and more natural looking. But we have to begin by making very definite shapes. So we started with a very definite light and shadow shape, and then this next step, when we break things, the lights and shadows up into 2 or 3 values, we need to be specific about those shapes, and so on and so forth. And if you work that way, then it doesn't matter how complicated you get, you're always making specific shapes, so you're getting very specific form. But once you start getting kind of sloppy, you're saying, well, I don't really see what that shape is, so I'm just gonna fuzz it in. It's not gonna look right because that's just not the way nature is. Nature's not fuzzy like that. It's very specific when you get right down to it. So even if you are not quite sure of the shape, just commit to making a definite shape. Just make your best guess at what that shape is, put it in. It's gonna work graphically better that way than if you get all mushy with it. Okay.